All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Parthivi Das, Executive Director of C2HR, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the latest installment of our learning series. C2HR is able to offer free, quality educational programs for our members, like today's learning series, thanks to the generous support of our 2024 sponsors, including Deloitte. We sincerely appreciate you. Today's topic is focused on the dynamics of human capital. For its 2024 Human Capital Trends Research, Deloitte surveyed more than 14,000 business and HR leaders across industries. Today's speakers will help us dive into the findings. We'd like today's webinar to be interactive and invite you to post questions and comments in the chat throughout the discussion. SHRM has approved this webinar for 1 CE credit, and the credit code will be emailed to all participants after the event. Today's featured Deloitte speakers are Jasmine Jacks, Principal of Media and Entertainment, and Laura Jordan, Managing Director, Media and Entertainment. Jasmine and Laura, we can't thank you enough for sharing your insight with us. I'll turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the opportunity. We're thrilled to be here today. Wanted to do some quick intros before we dive into the content. Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Jacks. I'm a partner in the media and entertainment industry at Deloitte. I also have the privilege of serving as our entertainment human capital leader. I spend my time with my clients helping shape their agendas around their talent and workforce priorities and how to drive adoption. As you can imagine, increasingly that topic is really centered around the topic of Gen AI and AI. I'm based here in LA, and I've been with Deloitte for over 11 years, and I'm a mom to a 4-year-old daughter. Laura, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Jasmine. Hi, everyone. Laura Jordan. Great to meet you and see you. Excited to be here. So I'm a managing director focused on media and entertainment as well. And I'm also based in Los Angeles, which means I get to see Jasmine pretty often. I partner with organizations such as yourselves on their biggest transformations. And a lot of these trends that we'll present today are things that Jasmine and I both encounter every day, and we're helping you work through and solve. So super excited to be here. And we really want this. I know, these sessions can sometimes feel a little one way. So we want as much as possible for you to use the chat today as you have questions. We have a couple of moments in the session where we'd like to get your feedback. So get ready to type away, and we'll be doing our best to monitor the chat and respond. So should we hop in? Okay. Here we go. We are so excited to talk about our new human capital trends in 2024. And really, these are continuing on a concept that we started last year. So in 2023, we introduced the idea that the world of work is becoming boundaryless. A world where work is no longer defined by jobs. The workplace is no longer a specific place. And many workers are no longer traditional employees. And I'm sure all three of those things resonate for everyone on this call. So this year, we are continuing our exploration of the boundaryless world. Our research highlights that, as work has become boundaryless, it's human performance that will help organizations unlock the new opportunities presented by this boundaryless world, helping both organizations and workers thrive amidst uncertainty and continued change. So to move the dial on human performance, we need to revisit some of the old measurements that we've traditionally relied on to drive human performance. As these become less relevant, it's also becoming clear that there's no easy playbook from the past to follow. So while they were once useful, the old tools, the old ways that we measured were really imperfect placeholders. So they allowed our organizations to scale when the number one thing was scalable efficiency. And that was how we differentiated ourselves. And they allowed organizations to measure progress against traditional boundaries of work. But things have changed. I think we all deal with a lot more complexity today, and our world of work is constantly reinventing itself. So just because it can be measured, or I guess the question would be, should we be measuring it anymore? And, you know, that we really have to think of new ways to measure our work. So let's not be held back by the old ways that we used to measure our workforce. So I think all of you have heard the concept, and all of your leaders talk about employee. And we would, for example, use that term employee to capture the singular notion of full-time staff. But what about our full ecosystem of workers that our organization needs to differentiate itself? Similarly, and this one I think is a little bit more nuanced, we used to rely on employee engagement to evaluate the relationship between organizations and workers. So my question to you is, should we really be measuring trust and metrics that benefit the worker? So if you're measuring how much discretionary effort workers are willing to expend for their organization's benefit, is that really helping the worker or helping the organization? So let's pop to the next slide. This year, we surveyed over 14,000 people from over 95 countries. So we're really proud of those numbers. We get great traction with this survey and these trends. And we hope next year, all of you participate and weigh in with your thoughts. So this year, we specifically surveyed workers and executives separately to understand the unique perspectives and challenges they each face. And our research revealed that a focus on the human factor is emerging as a bridge between knowing what shifts are shaping the future of work and doing things to make real progress against these trends. So let's move on, Keely. So while our research shows that many organizations haven't yet made that important mindset and operational shift needed to respond to the imminent future, our research also shows that knowing is not the barrier. So where organizations are generally getting stuck is in the doing. They know something needs to happen, they know they need to change, but really making those real actionable progress forward to unlocking that human performance is the tricky part. In fact, our analysis shows that those who are able to bridge the gap from knowing to doing in this year's trends are more likely to produce better business and human outcomes. And we all love new math, so let's flip to the next slide. There'll be a quiz later on the new math of human performance. Just kidding, no quiz. So this mutually reinforcing cycle of human and business outcomes is what we love to call human performance, because I think in all of our worlds, we know it's humans more than physical assets that are truly driving organizations forward. Traditional mindsets might suggest that organizations can either prioritize human outcomes or business outcomes, but not both at the same time. So the same mindsets typically put a premium on those business outcomes and underestimate the importance of human outcomes. We've introduced this new equation that shows how human outcomes can multiply business outcomes and vice versa to drive human performance. So as organizations look to shape and adapt ever-evolving future of work, prioritizing human performance will be key to building an organization that can thrive today and tomorrow. Okay, break from me. You'll get to hear from Jasmine. So Jasmine, why don't you go ahead and introduce our trends this year?
Sounds good. Thanks, Laura. So as Laura mentioned, the trends this year are really centered around this theme of human performance. And each of the trends that we've got listed here on this page really provides a set of guidelines on how to achieve and unlock that human performance for your organization and the workers. So just a quick overview of each of these trends. Starting on the left-hand side, we start with human sustainability. And what we mean by that is we really define the degree to which an organization creates value for people as human beings. So think of people kind of bringing their full selves to work and not just as workers, right? So to Laura's point, really moving kind of beyond some of those traditional productivity widget numbers that I think a lot of organizations historically have looked at. We explore what some of those kind of human outcomes really are and how actually focusing on creating more of those human-centered outcomes can help multiply the business outcomes as well. So how do we focus on prioritizing things like well-being and purpose in addition to looking at things like efficiency and productivity? The next trend looks at the new metrics beyond kind of that traditional productivity. And really, it pairs nicely with the trend that I talked about around human sustainability. So how well is an organization doing on achieving those greater human performance goals? And what are some of the new sources of data and analytics that can make that shift possible, like wearables, for example? Trust is a big topic as well. So trust is a new measure. Actually, Deloitte, we're using this as a measure ourselves internally within our talent data and our engagement scores. And how are we really having our clients look at trust as a measure, not only for their workforce, but their consumer trust as well, and the relationship between those two metrics? And to us, a lot of that kind of trust element is key to unlocking and underscoring that human performance element. Within that, there's also a tie to transparency, right? Because transparency can really help or hinder, in some cases, efforts to build that trust in a world where almost everything can be made transparent. There's a question of what should be made transparent to kind of increase that trust. Our next set of trends focus more on the how. So how can organizations really drive that human performance? And when we look at that, we look at things like how does Gen AI, for example, expose what we call, and we've coined this as a imagination deficit within the workforce. How do we focus on developing and building what we are calling kind of enduring or uniquely human capabilities, and providing workers with safe spaces to play and experiment in what we're calling digital playgrounds so that they can practice those skill sets that are going to be really critical for the future. Continuing the thread of really empowering the workforce of the future, we also explore how do you move away from a monolithic or singular corporate culture and really think about embracing diverse microcultures as a way to really support organizational agility and create a better workforce experience. Then looking at the shifts needed to make all of this a shared accountability. So how do we kind of move beyond the walls of just the HR function? How do we create more of a boundaryless discipline where it's a co-creation element, whether it's with your workforce or other functional leaders that sit outside of the walls of HR? And how do you really integrate the people, business, and community that you serve within your organization? So how do you bring in customers, for example, around co-creation of some of the elements from an HR standpoint? And then finally, we look at, what do these trends really mean for those who are responsible for leading organizations through all of this change around new ways of working? What does that mean for leadership as we think about the new high-tech, human-driven world that we envision in the future? So Laura, back to you to get a little bit more detailed into our trends.
All right. So for each of the trends that we studied, and Jasmine just gave that brief overview, we've measured this knowing versus doing gap. So that's the difference between how many respondents say this issue is really important to their success compared with those who say they are leading in the space. So you can see on this slide, in all cases, there's a pretty substantial gap. Trust and its relationship with transparency was ranked as the most important across all the trends studied this year. And it also had the largest knowing versus doing gap. When we asked about the reasons for the organization's inability to make progress to date, only a small portion of respondents, 33%, cited insufficient understanding. Instead, internal constraints such as capacity for change, limited resources, and lack of leadership alignment were consistently shared as the justification for the organizational inertia. So this is further proof that organizations are being held back by old mindsets, operating constructs, and the proxies of the past. So with that in mind, fueling human performance and leading in the boundaryless world will likely come from not only clearing those mental obstacles in the way, but the operational ones as well. So here we go. This is what I said. You guys get a chance to weigh in. We'd love to see what you're hoping to learn from today's discussion. And then if you can pop that in the chat, hopefully we can do our best, Jasmine and I could do our best to incorporate some of that as we go through today. So while those filter in, we can move forward. Perfect. And we'll just kind of keep monitoring that chat. So Jasmine and I really thought for you all in this specific industry space, we wanted to highlight 4 trends and go a little bit deeper into those that were what we feel are the most exciting and applicable to this space. So what we'll do is we'll talk in more detail around the transparency paradox, digital playground, workplace microcultures, and imagination deficit. And I'll kick it off with the transparency paradox. And then I promise I will not do all of the talking today, and you'll hear from Jasmine for the second half. Okay, I see it in the chat. Abel's interested in trust, so we will be sure to hit on that as we go forward. And let me do that right now, Abel. So here we go. Trust between an organization and its workers is increasingly important. I think all of us deal with this every single day. And as Jasmine mentioned, we're measuring this at Deloitte internally to see how our workers are trusting our organization. It's really thought that transparency is something that drives trust. But as you think about building trust between workers and the organization, the relationship between trust and transparency is pretty complicated and nuanced. As new developments and technology can make almost anything in an organization transparent to anyone, organizations are discovering that mishandling transparency can actually undermine trust. So let's flip to the next slide and dive into this a little bit deeper. So several trends today are putting trust at risk. I think we all see the rise of misinformation. We hear the headlines, things that our companies and our clients are doing every day are in the news. There's turbulence related to outsourcing, lots of rumors around M&A, downsizing, digital transformation, return to the office. All of these things add to the uncertainty of the current environment. And then just go ahead and pile on Gen AI, and workforce trust becomes even more important. So how can organizations elevate workforce trust? 86% of leaders in our survey say that the more transparent an organization is, the greater the workforce trust. But transparency isn't what it used to be, and this assumption may no longer hold true. When we talk about transparency, this has traditionally been one-way street. So organizations and leaders share information with workers. But today, transparency can work the other way around too, thanks to all of the new technology and worker agency. So examples of transparency from workers include how and where people are working, organizational experiences from social media posts, or analysis of worker data from collaboration platforms or email. Technology can now make everything and everyone in our organization transparent based on data from sensors, software systems. There's over 400 different sources on average that employers can see about their workers, like their time at keyboard, the emotional tone while interacting with a customer or colleague, movements and interactions throughout the day, and the distance and routes covered by drivers. As organizations and leaders find this degree of transparency alluring, it can also be a goldmine and a landmine. If an organization uses this transparent data responsibly, it can create new opportunities to create shared value for both workers and the organization. On the other hand, there's a lot of potential for misuse, which could lead to privacy breaches or AI-driven surveillance. Transparency shouldn't be implemented just for the sake of being transparent, with the assumption that it will automatically create trust. The flip side of transparency is privacy, which sometimes can build a better path of trust. So getting this balance right is critical, and trust is earned with difficulty, but can be lost with ease. So let's flip to the next slide, and we can dive in a little bit more. Most organizations are pretty early on in this journey. Only 13% of respondents surveyed said their organizations are leading in addressing trust and transparency between themselves and workers. So in the report, and we'll put a link to that at the end, we describe a number of examples for types of information that organizations might consider making transparent, and others that we caution against. But broadly, there's two key areas. Put transparency in conversation with privacy, and bring workers together in conversation with leaders about what and why information should be made transparent, and to whom and how. So each one of those should be an intentional question and then an answer. Why am I using this data? Who is it benefiting? How should I share this data? Who should see this data? All right, and then on the last slide, the next slide, sorry, to wrap it up, just a few questions for each of you to consider as you grapple with the transparency paradox. So how transparent do you consider your organization when it comes to leadership decisions and organizational change? This is something that I have to talk to my clients about, I feel like almost every day. When should something be made public? Who should know? And how far down in the organization do these decisions go, or are they communicated? So how transparent are you when it comes to leadership decisions and organizational change? Are there processes you intentionally keep private to preserve psychological safety? And finally, are you measuring trust within your workforce? And now maybe is the time to start. So Jasmine, do you want to take it over on
I would love
one of my
to.
favorite trends?
I would love to. One last note just on the measurement of trust. I think I mentioned that we at Deloitte have started doing this for our own talent in terms of embedding our trust index in our talent surveys. And I think the nice thing about measuring trust we found is it can be as easy as 4 kind of key questions that you can put into your survey, and I think gives you a really nice baseline from a workforce standpoint. So it doesn't have to be a big exercise. It could be as simple as embedding those 4 questions, and we can share more about that offline as well. Okay, let's talk about the imagination deficit. Love to hear that this is one of your favorites, Laura. It happens to be one of mine too. And I think it's very relevant as we think about the skills organization of the future and what should be the focus of building, what kind of skills in the midst of new digital advances like generative AI. And what we're actually seeing is what we're coining this imagination deficit. I think this one's really relevant because as we think about, your industry and our industry in particular, there happens to be a big emphasis around doing more with less, right? There's just so much change happening everywhere from a leadership standpoint, from an organizational standpoint, technology standpoint. And I think, particularly as you think about the disruption with technology, there's going to be a real strain in terms of capacity of organizations and workers to prioritize everything. And so what that's going to require is a bigger focus on the effort that you want to put forward on how and where to scale, and what we call really these enduring human capabilities, right? So what's going to be unique for you to really prioritize and harness and develop from a workforce standpoint around those skills. And we found that those are things like curiosity, empathy, creativity, to realize some of those new opportunities that the technology will bring forward. So if we go to the next slide, so as we see, right, we're seeing so much new technology, and we're seeing that technology get better at replicating a lot of the functional and technical aspects of work. So what does that mean for humans? I think that's the million-dollar question, right? And where do we differentiate? It's going to be around what we do differently to either interact and engage with the technology to get it to work for us better, but also how it changes the work that we do and the roles that our workers are playing within the organization. And so what we mean by that is, like, there's really these opportunities to double down on building what I was saying earlier around the human capabilities, right? I think there's been two in our research that have really stood out, and that's empathy and curiosity in particular. And we see some of those numbers here, right? 76% of workers say that their organization is helping imagine how their job may change in the future. But only 43% say that their organization is already doing some of this. So it's going to be important to do, but they're not really doing it yet. And then a large majority, I think 71% of our execs that we surveyed actually said that their organization's plans for Gen AI include using it to advance the human capabilities of their workers. So there's already emphasis being put in terms of planning, to think about how we're going to fill some of the gap that we're seeing here. And, I think the other key point to kind of put out on the table that's probably on everybody's mind is that there's some real concerns about the technology and what it's going to mean for the workforce in the future, right? There's some anxiety in the ecosystem around, is the technology going to come and take over my job and make, my skills not relevant anymore? And I think what we're actually seeing is some upside to some of those concerns from a workforce lens. We're actually seeing 70% of workers who are willing to actually delegate more work and as much work as possible to AI to help free up time for other things and enhance their creativity. So while there's this anxiety in the ecosystem, there's also this openness to kind of shift a lot of the work if it helps me unlock, opportunities for things that we say are uniquely human, like creativity. There's also increasing recognition of the importance of these human capabilities from a global level. So the World Economic Forum's top 10 core skills actually only included one technical skill, and the 9 other skills in that top 10 list were what we call human capabilities or soft skills, like creative thinking, resilience, curiosity. So really interesting kind of shift, I think, given the rise of technology. We should still continue to prioritize these human skills and capabilities. So if we go to the next slide, so how do we unlock some of this? So there's a role here to play both on the organization side and the worker side in activating, mitigating, I would say, the imagination deficit and activating the development of those skills. So from an organizational perspective, there's a couple steps that can be taken. The first is actually operationalizing human capabilities as part of the overall workforce strategy, right? We used to be so focused, I think, on the technical skills, right? What do we need in terms of engineering and this, and that? And that's still important for sure. But I think at some moment in time, a lot of those soft skills got deprioritized. And it sounds counterintuitive, but what we're actually saying is that soft skills are actually going to be really important in being able to get the ROI that organizations are looking for in this new technology advancement. It's harder to measure for sure. But one way that we see organizations start to measure more of those soft skills is by looking at things like collecting peer or manager, feedback, simulations, or even leveraging AI to infer some of those skills based on workers' behaviors. The second thing organizations can do is practice imagination. So bringing imagination back to the workforce. And the way that this can happen is by encouraging workers to actually use those skills for outcomes that are important both to that individual as well as to the organization. And what I really love about this, and this will go to the next trend we'll talk about shortly, is the more that you engage your workforce and some of the, practicing of these skills and working with, AI, for example, to practice some of that creativity or, curiosity, that group can really become almost like a change network for you as you think about building AI fluency skills within the organization. So you're able to really tap into both kind of the soft skills around creativity while you're developing some of those more technical skills from an AI standpoint. The third step that organizations can take is to really highlight for workers, teams, managers, the need to prioritize these skills. Again, I feel like at some point in time, soft skills got a bad rap, and it's time to rebrand a little bit around those skill sets, right? And so I think leaders have a responsibility to communicate the importance of curiosity and empathy, and to, consistently model, asking questions in meetings, sincerely listening to what workers have to say, wanting kind of that engagement two-way versus, deprioritizing some of that in their management and leadership styles. Finally, I think providing opportunities and venues for workers to explore, experiment, disrupt, co-create. Again, we'll talk about this a little bit more in the next trend, but how do you create those moments, right? Both ad hoc, but also built into the day-to-day work where there's an opportunity to actually exercise that imagination more, like hackathons, for example. I think one really good example of an organization that's putting this into practice is IKEA. They implemented recently an AI bot in its call center. So that bot was able to handle most of the routine kind of customer questions that were coming in. And then they actually invested in a comprehensive upskilling initiative for those call center workers to become interior design advisors or develop other skills that really required more complexity and could be more value add for their customers. And not only, as you can imagine, did that lead to, increase in sales, but definitely, contribution to skill development and engagement from a workforce standpoint as well. So lots of creativity with that example. All right, if we go to the next slide, oh, thank you. Just a couple questions here around, how you're seeing imagination and this imagination deficit, and how do you kind of tap into that imagination of your workforce? How are you helping your workers reimagine how their work can be done? Are you bringing them into that conversation as you think about piloting AI use cases, right, and other technologies? Are you thinking about, how you democratize access to some of those tools? I think oftentimes we see, access within certain pockets of more technical individuals within an organization or more senior. Are you really thinking about democratizing that more widely and tapping into the imagination of your broader workforce? So just some food for thought to leave you with on this trend. So, okay, if we go to the next one, we have an imagination deficit. So what do we do about it? As I recently hit on, right, creating spaces for your workforce and beyond your workforce, honestly, to experiment and bring kind of play back into the work through what we call these digital playgrounds is an amazing way to harness that imagination. It's really about imagining play with new technologies to unlock some of that innovation that I think everyone is after right now. All right, we go to the next slide. So beyond sounding really cool, what does digital playground actually mean? Let's unpack that a bit. So it's not necessarily a singular place or a virtual platform. It's actually more of a mindset and an approach. And what we mean by that is think about how are the technologies curated? What are the opportunities to use them and who has those opportunities? And how do you think about things like Gen AI, digital twins of a physical space, virtual reality, advanced analytics, and more? It's really about kind of creating that safe space for workers to be able to build their confidence, learn new skills, and hone what we're referring to as those human capabilities. I think, in the work that I'm doing with clients, the ones that are dipping their toe into the AI and Gen AI realm, one of the things they always ask us is, what are you hearing from a workforce standpoint? And obviously a lot of that still is around, mistrust from the workforce around the technologies and anxiety about their job. I think one of the best ways to actually mitigate that is by ensuring that you're going to upskill your workforce to be able to operate in this new world. And so how great would it be to democratize, some of those access pieces to your workforce so that they can start to build organically some of those skill sets. One of, in these times of kind of high anxiety, as I mentioned, play can really help people not only upskill themselves, but also start to understand, what the technology is all about, get more comfortable with it, but also help co-create kind of the future with you, right? I think one of the stats that we have here on the slide is really compelling. Only 13% of workers have actually been offered any kind of AI-related skills training in the past year. So this is going to be an area that a lot of us think is going to be a critical skill in the future, but there's not investment put in so far within a lot of organizations to really upskill. I think, several factors that are driving the need for an organization to bring more of this play into focus. The first is that entry-level roles are actually declining, or they may require kind of new skills as the application of automation and AI could kind of take away the needs around some of the entry-level roles. So how are you kind of rethinking that? As work becomes more dynamic, less predictable, and more composed of making judgments in the face of kind of changing data, it's really important that, again, we're focusing on some of those human capabilities within the work itself. And then workers need time and space, right? Like this is a new era around the technology. And so giving your workers the time and space to really learn how to collaborate with some of these technologies is going to make them much more equipped to be part of your workforce of the future. All right. So how do you embrace this? If we go to, thank you, the next slide. I think a great example of this is what Microsoft has done. If you're not familiar, Microsoft has been building a concept that they call the Microsoft Garage. Their motto, which I love, is doers, not talkers. They actually not only engage employees in their digital playground, but also customers and partners. And they've created this kind of ecosystem of digital exploration and play. Part of what they do is a global hackathon with 70,000 employees globally participating. And they actually have physical spaces all over the globe that they shape different, things like learning events or helping kind of create cross-pollination within their technologies. So just really cool opportunity to make this kind of digital playground real. I think the one thing I would just leave you with, and this is going to be a consistent, message across all these trends, is it doesn't have to be super complicated. I think, yes, you could create an overarching enterprise-wide culture of digital play, but there are very quick things that you can do by starting where you are with what you have, like democratizing access. So if you're going to be, taking on Gen AI or AI tools, think about, the access that you're going to create around, having, those tools or licenses for different parts of your workforce. Encourage play, as we said, for workers so that they can build their confidence, learn new skills, connect that play to their work. So think about what are some of the problem sets that are relevant to your teams or your organization, and where would you want to get some of that engagement in the playground to be actually used in the daily work, right? I think there's also an opportunity to think about, how you might collect worker data. How might you negotiate kind of the use of that data as you encourage the use of new tools and technologies to kind of better equip your organization and your learning as well. Another example I just quickly wanted to share, which I thought was really interesting around the digital playground trend, is from actually the Vancouver airport. So totally out of our industry, but I thought what they did was really unique. They launched a real-time interactive digital twin of the airport in 2022. And that platform was something that they used to envision, like, what else could they use the spaces for? They used it to actually drive daily decision-making based on data extracts, as well as look at future opportunities for improvements or innovation. It also helped support worker training and testing of new methods for the airport itself. And then they used data from passenger demand to be able to staff and forecast different wait times. So just a lot of really cool stuff. My favorite, living in LA and dealing with LAX traffic, is they had cameras actually detect if the vehicles had been parked within the terminal curbside for an extended period of time. And then operations and security could come in and address it and just really help improve the overall flow of traffic, which is awesome for that community. All right. Digital playground, some questions to leave you with on this trend. So just think about, what are some ways, again, it doesn't have to be super complicated, but that you can bring some of that curiosity and experimentation to your workforce. What are some challenges that you may be facing or have you faced when you've thought about this digital playground concept in the past? Another kind of quick lesson from Deloitte, we actually did a prompt-a-thon with all levels of our talent, where we gave them a set of AI technologies and said, go off, create your own teams, see what you come up with. And it was great because, one, as I mentioned earlier, that group kind of became a change network for us and how to leverage the technology before we launched it to everybody. And then we actually created some, client solutions, AI tools that we're now using on some of our engagements. So definitely helped problem solve for our organization and spark that creativity. And as you can imagine, particularly our Gen Z workforce loved the opportunity to do that. All right, let's go to the last trend, which is our microcultures. This is one that I know many of my clients, and Laura, you as well, are familiar with, right? So how do you really think about your corporate culture when you have, multiple brands, maybe heritage brands that you've acquired over time, right? What does it look like, especially as we anticipate a lot more M&A to happen within this industry as well? What are some of the strategies to kind of create that overarching corporate shared values, but still allow for, microcultures to exist, to be able to drive better agility for the organization? I think, a lot of times we recruit for cultural fit, but in reality, I think, you'll find at most organizations, it's really hard to find a singular, uniform and articulated culture. And again, there's trade-offs to, having that and not having that. And I think what we're seeing is actually the rise of microcultures can drive a lot of benefits around agility and better experience for the workforce as well. Okay, go to the next slide. So what is a microculture? We define it as subtle variations in how work gets done as we look at different teams, functions, geographies. It's got to be, some kind of organization that's driving those microcultures. But also it helps with organizations being able to respond more quickly to the people that they serve. So it's kind of the notion of one size does not fit all, and what are the important kind of trade-offs in enabling those microcultures. So really, we think of organizations of having a culture of cultures tailored to the needs of local teams. But what's really important is there still needs to be this alignment to what we call organization-wide values. So that needs to be the umbrella with which, within which all of these microcultures operate, so that there's that overall wrapper. Otherwise, that's not going to be super helpful to your workforce in any kind of change that you're driving or workforce experience, or even, to be honest, with your consumers, if you don't have some kind of overarching wrapper around those shared values. I think it was interesting looking at some of the data, right? 50% of execs said that organizational culture is most successful when there's a moderate degree of variation. And interestingly enough, this trend out of all the trends this year was rated as the most difficult to address. But 73% of workers have also left a job due to the poor cultural fit. So it is still a very important trend, but it is a hard one to, I think, really get right and wrap our heads around, what the right nuances look like that you should allow while having that overarching shared values, right? I think the other kind of benefit to this, right, is we're going to see, and we have seen, and we do have a very diverse workforce. It's only going to get more and more diverse. And when you think about, a lot of our global brands and the ecosystem of talent, right, what we refer to as that ecosystem of full-time employees to contingent workers, again, the differences around what's going to matter the most or how those organizational areas are going to want to function is going to look slightly different. And so the more that you can get kind of nuanced around that and shape the right kind of practices and behaviors, the better you're going to have a workforce experience and retention for your organization. Okay, next, how do you harness? So some things to consider include integrating microcultures into the talent life cycle. So really thinking about things like how you recruit your talent differently across those different microcultures, and allowing for some of that nuance, right? And same with performance management, right? What are the things, the behaviors and practices that are most important to specific teams, and how do you kind of adapt to that unique culture? Leveraging your leaders as that connection point, and what I like to say, cultural translators across the microcultures, so that, again, you're tying back to that common set of values. And lastly, providing the tools and data to enable kind of ongoing sensing, so that you're able to get, right workforce engagement scores, for example, and can course correct teams that maybe have gone a little bit rogue, but also spotlight, best practices or learnings across the different microcultures that you're experiencing. Really good example of this is within Google. The Google Cloud team is actually embedding microcultures into how it measures performance management of their workforce. So Google Cloud is actually the only kind of B2B company within that portfolio, so different than the rest of Google. And the Google Cloud people team recognized the need to have those kind of unique microcultures that reinforce customer empathy. So that was very different than maybe the majority of the organization. And so they created tenets of customer empathy within their teamwork attribute of the performance review process. So while all Googlers are expected to think about, how they're exemplifying teamwork, this particular part of the organization is actually tied to customer empathy culture tenets. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Just some questions to leave you with here. What are some of the benefits that you've seen from enabling microcultures within your organizations? And then how are you doing some of that sensing, right? Are you doing some of that sensing so that you can do some of the course correction and bring those microcultures back to, that shared values within the organization if you see anything going rogue there? All right. That was a lot of talking. Those were our key trends that we thought would be most relevant to you all, right? Would love to maybe share or hear from you now that we've shared more about the trends. Like, what are the trends that maybe resonated with you? What questions or key takeaways do you still have? Would love to see maybe some thoughts in the chat if you're still with us. And maybe while you're thinking through that, I would love to leave you with some last words of advice. I think we said this earlier, but I think a lot of this can feel really big, a lot of these concepts. So I encourage you to start where you are with what you have, not overcomplicate, but really continue to build some of the strategies that you've already got in motion that bring your organization closer to some of the trends that we shared, right? I think a lot of my clients are feeling very overwhelmed within HR right now. There's so much going on. They always feel behind. They have less budgets. There's this pressure to kind of get everything perfect and go off and create a whole AI academy, for example, and take 3 months to go build that before they launch AI fluency. And it's like, okay, but by the time you've built that out, the technology has already advanced exponentially and you're behind the mark. Just start with something small, right? Get some people in a room, democratize some of your tools, and see what you can get through some of that play.
I think, Jasmine, that's an interesting concept too, because I think so many times they'll roll some new technology out to leaders first. What a great opportunity to really help your culture by having everyone, or like not a horizontal of the org, not the top, not the bottom, but like a subset, that whole vertical, and people can learn from each other. There could be a lot of reverse mentorship happening there with these new tools. So it's a great opportunity to build connection throughout your workforce.
Absolutely. And I think it's so great too to be able to find some of the influencers within your organization that are already using these tools in their daily lives. And how do you kind of tap into their expertise and problem solve in really interesting ways for your organization? All right. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Jasmine and Laura. I mean, you've given us a lot to think about. I was looking, some people had some questions in the Q&A. I think you got one person's question answered, Jasmine, to discuss the difference between workplace cultures and cliques in the workplace. And then there was one more going
Around
back.
trust.
Trust.
Yeah, I can send that through as well. Maybe we can send that and we could send it to everybody after the call if that works.
That definitely works.
Perfect.
We can share that when we share the video and the CE information. We can put all that in one email to everyone. Were there any other questions? I mean, you gave us so much information. I think it's going to take a while for people to process everything. This has been really insightful. Another minute or two. Does anyone have any additional questions? Here is one from Melissa. What are your thoughts on transparency and pay?
Well, that's always a fun one. A lot more of that is becoming more and more transparent thanks to the latest regulations that are out there. I wish I had a one-size-fits-all answer to this, but I think a lot depends on how you pay people at your organization and the culture that you have and what's important and how you communicate. So happy to have a further conversation on it, but I can't give a blanket answer.
Yeah.
Unless, Jasmine, you have some secret that
I don't have a blanket answer, but Melissa, maybe something from our own lessons learned. So I mentioned that we implemented the trust scores for ourselves, measuring the trust of our workforce. And actually, one of the things that we implemented as a result of seeing the trust scores for ourselves was more transparency on pay, because that was one of the things that our workforce indicated would increase trust. And so we started to publish more around kind of the pay bands and the relationship between performance and pay, as a direct result of some of the trust measures that we saw. So not a specific answer to your question, but this is definitely, I think, something, to Laura's point, that a lot of organizations are facing, and they're on a wide range of maturity around how prepared they are to create more of that transparency.
So really the trust piece is key. And when you were talking about, from everything, like that's where it's all, from there, everything else is stemming and flowing from that piece. Let's see if anything else pops up. Well, close to finishing up then. And Melissa Hicks, today's workforce features several generations with very different expectations. How do you build culture and engagement that embraces all?
I think, what's important is first you've acknowledged it right there. There are different expectations. And so how do you, as you look to build that culture, intentionally think through the different aspects that appeal to each? And I don't think you can say, everyone wants to come to a lunch and learn, and that's how they're going to learn, for example. So you can offer these same types of experiences or similar types of experiences and access to information in different ways. And so by doing that, you can really embrace the different generations in the workforce. I think we see this on our teams every day in consulting. It's fun that I'll work with people fresh out of college and those that are senior to me. And, you can see just every day, day to day, that people have different expectations for how they want to engage, how they want to connect after work hours, what they want to do, what they don't want to do. And really just acknowledging that and setting the expectation with leaders that it's okay to be different and to have different opportunities for all really helps. I don't know, Jasmine, if there's anything you want to add.
No, I think that's spot on, Laura. And I think not assuming, even by generation, what some of the preferences are. I think having a conversation team by team is something we've started to do more and more at Deloitte, when we start a new project, and hearing what people's expectations are around some of those norms and being able to kind of meet everybody halfway to the best of our ability. So fan of like explicitly asking people, because it's going to be different for everyone. And then as much data that you can get at the central level and cut some of your engagement surveys, for example, generationally, would be amazing as well.
Great. Well, I think we're coming to the end of the hour. So I really want to thank Laura and Jasmine for taking the time, and everyone at Deloitte too for supporting C2HR. It's been very insightful. And what we will do is send everyone a recording of today's session and the C information. And want to thank everyone in the C2HR community for taking time today to be part of the HR Learning Series. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Have a good rest of your day.
Thank you all.